How did I take one of my clients, a very advanced lifter that's been training for 20 years, from okay progress to adding 75 pounds on his total in just 9 weeks? Well, that's what this video is all about. Make sure you stay tuned until the end for some practical takeaways, some of which are really easy to mess up and can make or break your progress, just like we saw for my client Dustin. All right, today's video really comes down to what's called fatigue management. Let me explain. So I'll start by saying that fatigue is a weird thing. In the research, fatigue is often defined as a decrease in performance below baseline. However, I honestly don't love this definition, so instead, I will define fatigue as any physical or psychological factors that take away from maximum strength capacity. Now, maximum strength capacity might be a little bit confusing. To wrap our heads around this, it might be helpful to think of a taper. So a taper, or a temporary reduction in training stress, pretty reliably increases strength. And this is why almost every powerlifter does a taper in the 1 to 2 weeks before a competition. The reason a taper works is because there's basically always some fatigue present. And this fatigue takes away from expressing our quote-unquote maximum strength capacity. Hopefully this visual helps. As you can see, normal productive training causes some fatigue. The dotted blue line represents a taper, which allows us to express our max strength capacity. However, this is just the start of the fatigue discussion. Fatigue exists on a spectrum, starting with this normal training fatigue all the way to what's called overtraining syndrome. Between normal training fatigue and overtraining, we also have what's called overreaching. In my experience, overreaching is very misunderstood, but hopefully I can clear some of this up for you. I'll break this concept of overreaching into 2 categories. The first is overreaching with stagnation. The second is overreaching with regression. Let's start with the first. When experiencing overreaching with stagnation, we can potentially still recover to max performance capacity after a taper. However, there's a fine line here because overreaching can also cause regression. As you can see from the orange dotted line, this overreaching is much harder to recover from. So put simply, if your training is leading to overreaching that causes regression, it probably is not worth it. Lastly, we have overtraining syndrome, which is characterized by sustained, unrecoverable decreases in performance for months, often accompanied by negative physiological and psychological effects. Now, it's been argued that true overtraining syndrome has never actually been reported in the research, so it's unlikely that this is something we need to fear in practice. Personally, I've never come across it with a client I've directly worked with. Nonetheless, overtraining would likely look like this on our handy figure. As you can see, performance not only decreases, but it's very hard to recover from it, even after a taper. Now, I want to emphasize that this figure is conceptual and simplified, and there's some nuances it fails to account for. For example, it fails to account for some practical downstream factors that can come alongside training fatigue. These include factors such as aches and pains, disturbed mood, decreased motivation to train, and disturbed sleep. Circling back to my client Dustin, here's his data in the first couple blocks we did together. He's making some progress here, but it's not all that convincing. We actually did a taper at the end of this, and he had a couple small PRs, indicating to me that we weren't in that overreaching with regression zone, and we definitely weren't in the overtraining area. So I think he was somewhere between that normal training fatigue and overreaching with stagnation line. Now, here's where things get interesting. Dustin was presenting with some of those downstream factors that can come alongside training fatigue. The biggest one in his case being aches and pains. He wasn't necessarily injured, but these aches and pains were causing him to miss some sessions and also deload early. So we weren't able to apply the best stimulus that we could. As a result, I think his max performance capacity wasn't increasing at the best rate possible. So we experimented with some programming changes. After a few blocks of experimentation, we cracked the code, if you will, and Dustin hit PRs on all of the big 3. So what did we do? Well, it came down to better managing fatigue. Specifically, we pulled back hard on his secondary days, and here's what that looked like. Some lifters or coaches may think these secondary days are not hard enough to progress, and while that might be the case on average, it clearly works for some. And when I take a step back, I think there's two reasons for this. First is that better fatigue management through some easier sessions meant less missed sessions and less deloads, which actually increased the total training workload when you zoom out over a longer time period. And secondly, this improved fatigue management meant feeling much stronger for his primary days for each of the main lifts. And these primary days are where he's usually hitting a heavy single, double, or triple. Because he's more recovered and feels strong, this leads to heavier training loads, which is arguably the most important variable for strength development. Once we nailed this program design, things really took off. Dustin added 75 pounds to his PR total in a 9-week period. And again, mind you, he's been training for 20 years. So hopefully you can tell that there's a delicate balance to be struck here. On one hand, fatigue is basically always going to be present with hard, productive training. On the other hand, if fatigue is too high, that will compromise the lifter's ability to sustainably train with heavy enough loads or train with enough volume. All right, let's wrap up with some takeaways. First, recognize that max strength capacity is often masked, and it's masked by fatigue. But again, fatigue is a necessary byproduct of hard training. This is totally fine and expected, so long as you're avoiding training fatigue-induced regression. Regression can occur for many reasons, including just bad programming or outside of gym factors. However, if regression seems to be occurring because of excessive training fatigue, you're probably overdoing it. Third, periodize the degree of quote-unquote acceptable fatigue. If you're far out from competition or testing, you may be okay with more fatigue and slower top-end strength improvements as you focus on other characteristics such as hypertrophy. Lastly, design training to protect your primary days. I like to tell my lifters that secondary and tertiary days may have a decent bit of fatigue going into them, but that's totally okay. However, training should be set up so the lifter feels good going into their primary day of the week, which again is typically the heaviest day. All right, that's the video. Please subscribe and check out the related videos somewhere on the screen here, and we'll see you in the next one.